By August 1941, Japan's military situation looked grim. What started as a border skirmish around Beijing had evolved into full-scale war, draining more and more resources from the empire. Although it was far superior to its Chinese counterpart, the Japanese army had a hard time coping with logistics and was subject to an intense guerrilla war. Chinese forces moved rather easily in the countryside and avoided pitched battles, limiting Japanese occupation to heavily fortified cities and railways. Even worse, the Allies, unwilling to see Japan threaten their local interests while they were busy dealing with Germany, supplied the United Front with oil and equipment. After opportunistically occupying Vichy Indochina to disrupt the Chinese supply lines, Japan was placed under a total embargo of its economy by the Western powers, paving the way to further escalation. With its strategic oil reserve halfway to depletion and oil supplies from the USA and Dutch East Indies halted, Japan needed to do something fast. Still nursing wounds after their defeat against the Soviets, the army had decided to join the Navy's doctrine of southern expansion, oil and rubber beckoning them on. In order to cut China from its suppliers, they planned to launch a sudden southern campaign using the already seized French Indochina as a springboard. With Western colonizers distracted by the war in Europe, it was the perfect moment to seize the resource-rich Southeast Asia. Their first objective was the rubber-rich British colony of Malaya. At its terminus, Malaya is the southernmost point of the Asian mainland. The peninsula juts down approximately along a north-south axis and has been historically inhabited by the Malays, an Austronesian people. Malaya has a spine running down the centre, a ridge of jungle-covered hills rising to about 2,100 metres in the north and sloping down to 910 metres in the south. On either side of the hills lie coastal plains, flanked on the west coast by mangrove swamps and the east by sandy beaches. Heavy rainfall causes the vegetation to grow densely. For the most part, Malayan jungles are far thicker than their Indian or Burmese counterparts. In 1941, the population totaled between 4 to 5 million. Of these, 2 million were Malays, 2 million Chinese, and the rest were Tamils from India. The European population totaled around 20,000. Located on the southern tip of Malaya is the small island of Singapore, inhabited by some 500,000 people divided into Chinese and Malays with a small number of Tamils, and even fewer Europeans. By 1941, Malaya had been under a British protectorate since the 18th century and was commonly known as British Malaya. This nomenclature was often used to refer to the federated and unfederated Malay states, which were British protectorates with their local rulers, as well as the Straits settlements, which were under the sovereignty and direct rule of the British Crown. Malaya, to the British, was not a bastion of imperial defence, but a gold mine, or, to be accurate, a rubber and tin mine. Before the war, the rubber estates, situated on the western plain of Malaya, produced over a third of the world's output, while the tin mines produced 80% of the world's tin. Because of that, European businessmen considered themselves above the local administration, and thoughts of conflict barely entered their calculations. Singapore, meanwhile, was a bustling crown colony and a strategic port forming an important cornerstone in the British imperial trade routes to the Far East. It was the bastion of the British Empire in the region. Malaya figured prominently in the plans of the Japanese General Staff. Japanese planners hoped to seize the southern resource area and additional strategic islands by executing 3 offensive drives. The first was to be directed against Malaya and Singapore. The second was to start soon afterwards with a seaborne invasion of the Philippines. These 2 drives would then converge against Java, the heart of the Dutch East Indies and a treasure house of strategic minerals. Meanwhile, the Japanese would occupy Thailand as a base for the third drive, an invasion of Burma. While planning the campaign, the Japanese High Command benefited from information which had fallen into its hands thanks to the German capture of the steamer SS Automaiden by the Hilfscruiser Atlantis on the 11th of November 1940. The documents, discovered in a chest meant for the British Far East Command, were taken to Rear Admiral Paul Vinecker, the naval attaché at the German embassy in Tokyo, and then handed over to Japan. The capture documents disclosed that there was no British fleet to help Singapore, and that Britain would not declare war if Thailand was invaded. The same document had also disclosed that Hong Kong was expendable. In the early stage of the planning of the southern operation, there was an issue whether to carry out the Malaya landing operation as a surprise attack or after extensive bombardment and air raids. The naval staff, fearful for the safety of their ships, suggested the latter, while the army, advocating the advantage of surprise, was convinced by intelligence from Germany that the British would do nothing until the war was declared. The army also stated that if a prolonged bombardment operation were to be conducted in December, the whole operation might end up as a fiasco because strong monsoon winds would spring up by mid-December, making the sea around Malaya extremely choppy. The matter was resolved when Vice Admiral Ozawa Jisaburo, commander of the Southern Expeditionary Fleet, stated,
"I understand the Army's desire to land quickly and without prior bombardment. I say that the Navy should accept the Army's proposals, even at the risk of annihilation."
Before the planning stages took place, Imperial General Headquarters established an intelligence unit in Taiwan in December 1940, headed by Colonel Tsuji Masanobu, to gather information about jungle warfare and the region's topography. It was given the cover name Taiwan Army Research Station or Doronawa Unit. Comprising some 30 officers and men, they threw themselves into their work, paying particular attention to Malaya. By the autumn, they concluded that Singapore's fortress was solid and strong on its seafront, but the rear-facing peninsula was practically defenceless. Newspaper reports of RAF fighter strength were intentional propaganda, exaggerating the real strength. The British Army in Malaya numbered from 5 to 6 divisions with a total strength of approximately 80,000. The proportions of European troops were probably less than 50%. On the 10th of November, both the Army and Navy reached an agreement for the assault of Malaya, codenamed Operation E. It stated that the Army, in collaboration with the Navy, will make a surprise landing at dawn on X Day to southern Thailand and northern British Malaya. On the same day, the Rikugun 25th Army was formed, and Tokyo detailed Lieutenant General Yamashita Tomoyuki to command it. Its ultimate objective was to capture the island of Singapore. Yamashita, a member of the Imperial Way faction, was not the first choice for Prime Minister Tojo Hideki to command the 25th Army. He owed his new appointment to his immediate superior, General Count Terauchi Hisachi of the Southern Army Groups. Terauchi conspired with like-minded officers to mortify Tojo by recruiting Yamashita. The Kaigun Southern Expeditionary Fleet, under the command of Vice Admiral Ozawa Jisaburo, was to provide the amphibious arm to the landing operations and then surface support as needed. It was also decided that Operation E would have 2 operational phases. For the first phase, there was to be the capture of Malaya. The army would land on southern Thailand and then rapidly drive south across Thailand's border into western Malaya. After Malaya was secured, the way would be opened for the second phase. That would consist of the capture of Singapore. For the invasion of Malaya, Yamashita's 25th Army had a total strength of 60,000 troops. His army comprised what was widely regarded as the best Imperial Army divisions. Initially, he was offered 5 divisions for the invasion. However, Yamashita felt he could accomplish the objectives with 4, and he shall call the 5th if he needs it. Several factors led him to this conclusion. First, Tsuji's research suggested that the peninsula's roads would be the centre of the battlefront. The flanks would extend no more than a kilometre to the left or right due to dense jungle. Second, intelligence reports indicated that most of the defending troops were not of the highest calibre. Third, he was underestimating British force strength in Malaya. By the 23rd of November, Yamashita had finalised the outline for Operation E. The plan for each of the divisions was strictly mapped out. On X Day, the day of the invasion, the 5th Division, with a tanks regiment support, would make the main landing in Singora and Patani. The Japanese hoped to avoid any fighting with the Thai forces, but if the latter interfered with the Japanese operations, then they should be crushed. The division would then rapidly drive south across Thailand's border into western Malaya. This advance aimed to capture the RAF fields along the northwestern Malayan coast in the vicinity of Alor Star and Butterworth, and then cross the Perak River into Perak province with its bridge still intact. Yamashita decided to press the attack as quickly as possible. He called this scheme a driving charge, or Kirimoni Sakusen, meaning he would seize the initiative from the outset and drive forward relentlessly, never permitting his numerically superior opponent to congeal into a formidable defence stance or to receive reinforcements. Yamashita believed that this driving strategy would result in the destruction of British forces in Malaya before they could retreat to Singapore. Meanwhile, the 56th Regiment of 18th Division was to land on the northeastern Malay coast near the critical northern airfield of Kota Baru on X Day, intending to capture the RAF airfield. The landing would provide a handy diversion, as Colonel Tsuchi believed that the RAF aircraft stationed there would pose a threat to the landing at Singora and Patani. The Imperial Guards Division would later move overland from Bangkok by rail and join the 5th Division, to become part of the 25th Army Reserve after it's assisted in the seizure of Thailand. While the southern advance was proceeding, these two divisions would occupy the main trunk road down Malaya's west coast and capture Kuala Lumpur. At the same time, the 56th Regiment of the 18th Division would operate along the eastern coast of Malaya. The rest of the 18th Japanese Division was to land at Singora and Patani in January 1942. The last division, the 56th, was put into reserve on Saigon, waiting for a deployment in the southeast of the Malayan Peninsula if necessary to assist the 18th Division's eastern thrust. After capturing Kuala Lumpur and Kuantan, the troops would move toward Johor Strait and capture the Johor Bridge if possible. The two-pronged thrust would then converge and the 25th Army would initiate the second phase of the operation, the capture of Singapore. The Japanese planners also intended to first neutralise the threat of RAF aircraft in Malaya with over 500 of its own from the Army 3rd Air Division under the command of Lieutenant General Sugawara Michio, and the Navy's 22nd Air Flotilla under Vice Admiral Tsukuhara Nishizo. Under the main landing, both the Army and Navy air services would immediately occupy the captured airfields in southern Thailand. A portion of the fighter and light bombers would then advance to northern Malaya on the same day and launch the aerial exterminating campaign to great success. When the Air Force had achieved air supremacy, it would then provide close air support to the Army's land charge. The General Headquarters estimated that all of these objectives should be achieved within 100 days after the landing. In case of overextension, the whole operation would be threatened as significant British and Commonwealth reinforcements could reach Malaya or Singapore after that period. When all these plans had been completed, Yamashita began to make his disposition within the 25th Army. The first was Lieutenant General Matsui Takuro's Rikugun 5th Division, tailored for the operation in Malaya and was fully motorized and specialized in amphibious operations. This formation had combat experience from China and had clashed with General Georgy Zhukov's mechanized Soviet forces at Nomonhan. Then came the Rikugun 18th Division, led by Lieutenant General Mutaguchi Renya, which had been battle-tested in China and specialized in light infantry operations in rough terrain. One of its regiments and a brigade headquarters was detached for operations in Borneo. The third was Rikugun Imperial Guards Division, commanded by Lieutenant General Nishimura Takuma. This division, however, presented a different story. The well-connected Nishimura headed the Army's most prestigious formation, but the division had last fought as a unit in 1905. Furthermore, 25th Army staff officers deemed the division's troops deficient in training and its officers arrogant and uncooperative. Lastly, there was Lieutenant General Watanabe Maso's Rikugun's 55th Division, which was put in reserve in Saigon. One of its regiments was detached to the 14th Army for the operation on the Dutch East Indies. As a support for the infantry were 2 regiments of heavy artillery and the 3rd Tank Brigade, with a total of 56 medium and 74 light tanks. This tank unit was to be the vanguard of the 25th Army's main thrust. Each division was supported by an engineer unit equipped to repair bridges and to conduct assault landings. Altogether, the 25th Army strength totaled 70,000 troops. Support from above was to be provided by the Rikugun 3rd Air Division. This Indochina-based formation was broken down into 3 air brigades, totaling 143 fighters, 170 bombers, and 63 reconnaissance aircraft, all placed under the command of Lieutenant General Sugawara Michio. His main objective was to gain air supremacy by aerial exterminating action, an offensive counter-air operation that involved the destruction of the enemy aircraft in the air and on the ground. The secondary objective was to provide air support to the ground forces and to conduct a strategic bombardment campaign in Malaya. Naval operations were to be carried out by the Kaigun Southern Expeditionary Fleet under the command of Vice Admiral Ozawa Jisaburo. Ozawa's objective was to lift the 25th Army to Thailand and Malaya and conduct a campaign to sever the British lines of operations and supplies to Singapore, as well as the Burma route. Under his command was heavy cruiser Chokai, his flagship, as well as Mogami, Mikuma, Suzuya and Kumano from Cruiser Division 7, light cruiser Yura, and 8 destroyers from Destroyer Squadron 3. His force was to provide close support to the invasion force. Also supporting the Southern Expeditionary Fleet were 6 submarines from the 4th Submarine Squadron and 2 from the 13th Submarine Division. The invasion force, staging from Hainan Island, consisted of light cruiser Sendai, 10 destroyers, 2 seaplane tenders and 3 minesweepers, which were to conduct the amphibious land operation in Singora, Patani and Kota Baru. Ozawa also was to support another Thailand landing force, which was to land at 4 different points on the Kra Isthmus. This force, carrying the 143rd Regiment of the 15th Army for the advance to Burma, consisted of 7 transport ships and was escorted by light cruiser Kashi. The Navy also provided its own air force. As the carrier force was required for the Hawaiian operation, the Southern Force received a sizable land-based air force. This was the 22nd Air Flotilla, drawn from the Kaigun 11th Air Fleet, under the command of Vice Admiral Tsukahara Nishizo. The 22nd Air Flotilla, based at Saigon, had 3 air groups, mainly composed of land-based long-range medium bombers. One of its air groups was detached from the 21st Air Flotilla. Also attached in this formation was a long-range naval fighters aircraft squadron. The 22nd Air Flotilla consisted of a total of 99 medium bombers and was supported by 37 fighters and 6 reconnaissance aircraft. Their task was to provide air cover for the Southern Expeditionary Fleet, to conduct strategic bombings on the enemy's strategic points, and to destroy any naval threat that could jeopardize the operation. Until the end of the First World War, there was no strategic threat to the British-dominated Malaya-Singapore region. The rise of Japan as a potential enemy after 1919 resulted in the British decision to develop a strategy to counter Japanese aggression. The strategy involved a number of different plans and stages developed between 1919 and 1941. The basic idea was to base a fleet of ships in the Far East. This fleet could then be used to stop and defeat a Japanese force heading towards India or Australia. In April 1919, the Plans Division of the Admiralty produced a paper which examined possible locations for a naval base in the Pacific in case of war with the United States or Japan. Hong Kong was considered but regarded as too vulnerable since it's too close to Japan, while Sydney was regarded as secure but too far from Japan. Singapore emerged as the best compromise location. Thus, on the 16th of June 1921, the British Cabinet formally agreed that a naval base should be built in Singapore. This plan was known as the Singapore Strategy. In the Singapore Strategy, planners divided a war with Japan into 3 phases. In the first phase, the garrison of Singapore would defend the fortress while the main fleet made its way from home waters to Singapore. Next, the second phase, the main fleet would relieve the defenders and sail from Singapore to relieve or recapture Hong Kong. The final phase would see the fleet blockade Japan and force it to accept terms. Before the strategy was made, the questions of defence were considered in the north of Singapore. The army gave the firm opinion that an attack from the Malayan peninsula was almost impossible because of the terrain and jungle. So the government agreed that the only possible attack on Singapore would be from the sea. Most planning focused on the first phase, which was seen as the most critical. This phase involved the construction of defence works for Singapore. Following surveys, a site at Sembawang was chosen for a naval base due to its commanding position over the British military route to the Far East through the Straits of Malacca, whilst being safe from any potential seaborne invasion from the south or east by keeping as far from the open sea as possible. Following next was 10 years of bickering between the services. The Air Ministry claimed that torpedo bombers, protected by fighters with the support of medium gun batteries, could provide a cheaper and more efficient defence system than heavy gun batteries. However, the Admiralty, having none of this, instead maintained that the heavy gun had always proved the strongest deterrent against the warship. It was in 1926 before the Committee of Imperial Defence decided that the first stage should include close and medium batteries, 3 15-inch guns, and by 1932 aircraft should be included into the defence system. But the work went very slowly. It was by the end of 1935 before the first phase was completed. Although Singapore was built into a first-class fleet naval base, Britain was no longer economically capable of supporting two fleets. Furthermore, the 1921 Washington Naval Treaty effectively prevented Britain from having two full fleets. Thus, Britain and her Far Eastern colonies were left with vague assurances that in case of an outbreak of war in Asia, the main fleet would be dispatched to Singapore. Parallel to the construction of the naval base, a forward airfield was constructed at Kota Baru and Kuntan. It was intended for the RAF to detect the invasion convoys as early as possible. However, the RAF did not consult with the army, resulting in a vulnerability to ground forces. Furthermore, the Malayan Peninsula had over 1,600 kilometers of coastal line, half of it exposed to Japanese attack. By 1937, an assessment by Major General William Dobbie and his Chief of Staff, then Brigadier Arthur Percival, concluded that any Japanese attack would advance from Thailand and northern Malaya. All his calculations were based on the assumption that a British fleet could not arrive in 70 days to carry out the relief. Dobbie also pointed out that the Japanese would probably establish advanced air bases in Siam. Based on this finding, Dobbie concluded that the land and air force detailed for the defence of Malaya had to be drastically increased. But by 1939, with war looming in Europe, and the allocation of priorities for land and air forces was to France and the United Kingdom and the Middle East. The events of the first year of war merely confirmed the commitment to the European and Middle East theatres. Singapore was starved of land and air reinforcements before war came to the Far East. Throughout 1940, as the situation in Europe, Russia and the Middle East worsened, the Far Eastern affair took last priority. However, in October, the Chief of Staff recommended a unified system of defence for the Far East under Commander-in-Chief. The man selected was Air Marshal Sir Robert Brooke Popham. The Far East Command was responsible for overseeing the defence of Malaya, Singapore, Burma and Hong Kong. As soon as his headquarters was in operation, he informed the Chief of Staff that Singapore could not be held for the fleet unless the whole of Malaya was also held, and at the moment there was a grave shortage of both troops and aircraft. He estimated that 566 first-line aircraft and 31 squadrons were needed, but the Chief of Staff only accepted 336 in 22 squadrons, and that figure would only be achieved by the end of 1941. Popham, however, remained sceptical, and with good cause. The main obstacles to dispatching reinforcement to the Far East were Winston Churchill, who wrote to the Chief of Staff that
the political situation in the Far East does not seem to require, and the strength of the Air Force by no means permits, the maintenance of such large forces in the Far East at this time.
Brooke Popham therefore never received the reinforcement he needed. However, he remained optimistic in the media press, and it was designed to deceive the Japanese. In March 1941, Lieutenant General Arthur E. Percival was appointed General Officer Commanding of Malaya. Upon his appointment, he found himself carrying out a tour in the peninsula and discovered that the airstrip was unused, as the RAF had not sufficient men or aircraft to occupy it. The fighter aircraft that the government had promised to send still was missing, and there was not a single tank in the whole area. Percival, concerned with the state of Malaya defence, estimated that he needed to increase the garrison troops up to 5 full-strength divisions, with a total of 48 infantry battalions, not counting fortress troops. In London, dispatch of Hurricane fighters was being discussed by the Chief of Staff. The RAF representative, however, argued that American Buffalo fighters, considered obsolete in Europe, would be more than a match for any Japanese aircraft. This view was accepted without question, as at the time Japanese were renowned for copying German avionics in a form of industrial plagiarism, thus the nasty surprise at first contact with the A6M0. Being advised, Brooke Popham remarked,
"We can get all right with Buffaloes out here. Let England have Super Spitfires and Hyper Hurricanes."
Chief of Staff also agreed to reinforce the Malayan troop strength, but it warned that it could not be met well before 1942. Malaya command was gradually increased throughout 1941. Ultimately, Percival's field forces amounted to 10 regular brigades, organised in 3 divisions of 2 brigades each, the 8th Australian Division and the 9th and 11th Indian Division, and 2 brigades deployed in Singapore Fortress. These were supported by second-line Indian battalions deployed as air-based defence forces, plus various volunteer forces. The whole amounted to some 32 regular infantry battalions, plus artillery and engineers, comprised of 10 brigades. Overall, Malaya Command had a total of 85,000 troops, and of them 15,000 were non-combatants. In addition, Percival also had 30,000 volunteers from the local and colonial population. The 11th Indian Division was under the command of Major General Murray Leon, was formed at Kuala Lumpur in October 1940. It consisted of the 6th Indian Brigade, the 5th Indian Brigade and Penang Fortress. This division was badly trained, and the officers were inexperienced. The 9th Indian Division, under the command of Major General Arthur Barstow, arrived in April 1941. It consisted of the 8th Indian Brigade and the 22nd Indian Brigade. The 25th Indian Brigade arrived in September and was assigned to the 9th Indian Division's reserve. All units in this division were heavily milked of senior and experienced personnel for raising further units in India. The growth of the command prompted Brooke Popham to press for a corps headquarters. The 3rd Indian Corps was accordingly formed in May. Lieutenant General Sir Lewis Heath, fresh from leading the 4th Indian Division to victory in East Africa, was appointed in command. The 3rd Corps was assigned to defend northern and central Malaya, with the 9th Indian Division responsible for the defence of the forward airfield situated on the eastern coast of Malaya on Kota Baru and Kuntan. The 11th Indian Division was deployed near the Thailand-Malayan border and was geared to prevent an attack from Singora. The 8th Australian Division, commanded by Major General H. Gordon Bennett, composed of the 22nd and 27th Australian Brigade, arrived in August. But its 3rd Brigade was deployed as a forward defence in the Dutch colonies. This left Bennett commanding an understrength formation. The 8th Australian Division was tasked with guarding Indal, Mersing and Johor states. The Singapore Fortress, under the command of Major General Frank Keith Simmons, composed of the 1st and 2nd Malayan Brigade, was tasked with defending the southern shore of the island. Its fixed defences consisted of the 7th and 8th Coastal Artillery Regiment, which boasted 5 15-inch, 6 9.2-inch and 18 6-inch guns, primarily designed and equipped to repel an attack from the sea. They were supported by 5 anti-aircraft regiments for the defence against attack from the air. The 12th Indian Brigade was assigned to Command Reserve, stationed on the west coast of Malaya. All these units had no experience in jungle warfare, and most were trained for desert combat. Percival's orders were to protect the airfields that the Royal Air Force had constructed to prevent them from being captured by the Japanese and being utilised by the Japanese aircraft. He was instructed to hold it until a significant reinforcement and the main fleet arrived from Britain. Percival's troops were scattered over a wide area due to the necessity of protecting the airfields in the north. Thus, his troops were present everywhere and strong nowhere. To make matters worse, he also lacked the reserves to contain the Japanese attack at the latter's point of choosing. Despite Churchill's attitude, RAF Far East also grew. In 1941, Air Vice Marshal Conway W.H. Pulford was appointed as the commanding RAF Far East. By late autumn, Pulford had a total of 158 first-line aircraft among 9 RAF squadrons, 5 Australian and 2 New Zealand. Fighter defence was in the hands of obsolete American-built Brewster Buffalo aircraft. 2 strike squadrons, number 36 and number 100, were equipped with the ancient Vickers Wildebeest, which were to carry torpedo attacks against enemy shipping. And number 205 squadron had Catalina flying boats for use in reconnaissance roles. Blenheims and Australian-crewed Hudsons provide the main bomber and photographic reconnaissance aircraft. The grand total of Pulford's Air Force when the war came was 362 aircraft, of which 233 were serviceable and 52 fighters in reserve. The Far East and Malaya commands spent most of 1941 developing the idea of a preemptive strike into southern Thailand. The concept of forward defence was first considered in 1937. By 1940, the fact that it would not force anyone to abandon any existing policy or plan made it more attractive. What came to be known as Operation Matador emerged by August as the focal point of planning in Singapore. This was a plan to rush forward and seize Singora in Thailand at the outbreak of hostilities and hold it against any seaborne invasion. General headquarters of the Far East believed that if the Japanese invaded Thailand, the Thai government would declare war on the side of the Allies and the British would be invited to advance into the country from Malaya. The troops detailed for this task were Major General Murray Leon's 11th Indian Division, who also had been detailed to deploy on the Malayan-Thai border. Because the British government policy was to refrain from any act of provocation, Operation Matador was to only trigger once the territory of Thailand had been violated. In July 1941, as the Japanese occupied Cam Ranh Bay, which put the Japanese uncomfortably close to Singapore, the Admiralty and Chief of Staff began considering what ship could be sent. In August 1941, the Royal Navy was proposing to send 7 capital ships, 1 aircraft carrier, 10 cruisers and 24 destroyers to the Far East. However, it would take until March 1942 to assemble and dispatch such a fleet. Winston Churchill noted that since the German battleship Tirpitz was tying up a superior British fleet, a small British fleet at Singapore might have a similar effect on the Japanese. The Foreign Office expressed the opinion that the presence of a modern battleship in Singapore might deter Japan from entering a war. In October, the Admiralty therefore ordered HMS Prince of Wales to depart to Singapore, where it would be joined by HMS Repulse. The carrier, HMS Indomitable, was to join them, but it ran aground off Jamaica on the 3rd of November and no other carrier was available. Thus, the second phase of the Singapore strategy was revived after all, but in a very modified form. The Navy was coming, but not with the main fleet, and barely a squadron. The force that arrived at Singapore therefore was badly unbalanced. It lacked an integrated air arm and could not rely on the Royal Air Force in Malaya to provide overhead cover. It lacked cruisers and had but 4 destroyers as escorts. Upon arrival at Singapore, the task force was designated as Force Z under the command of Admiral Tom Phillips, commander of the Eastern Fleet. The dispatch of Force Z to the Far East was an act of bluff, and that the British tried to deceive the Japanese into thinking they had concentrated a more substantial force at Singapore than was in fact the case. Churchill envisioned Force Z to serve first as a strategic deterrent, along with the American reinforcements to the Pacific. Should that fail, Force Z would revert to the mission of guarding the Indian Ocean communications against Japanese cruiser raids. The Malayan campaign series will continue to unfold. Next, we will dive deep into every battle, starting from the Japanese landing at Kota Bharu and ending with the fall of Singapore. We will see how the campaign progressed and how the Japanese and the British executed their respective plans in land, sea and air warfare. Were the British doomed from the start? Let us know by sharing your comments on Percival's pre-war planning below, And if you enjoy content like this and want to see more, please consider subscribing, sharing the video with your friends, or joining us on Discord. Thank you.